The horse moved with a steady, rocking gait that had long since ceased to register. For 3 days, Jackson Thorne had ridden under a sky the color of bleached bone, a pale, endless canvas that offered no comfort and no answers. The wind was a constant companion, a dry, rasping thing that carved at the sandstone bluffs and scoured the soul clean of everything but grit and memory. Dust settled on his hat, in the folds of his shirt, on his tongue. It was the taste of Montana territory, the taste of forgetting. Jack, at 32 years of age, looked a decade older. His movements were spare, his gaze fixed on a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. He was a man running, not from the law, but from the quiet moments when the ghosts found him. They came on the scent of wood smoke, which smelled too much like the hearth he had built with his own 2 hands. They came in the phantom weight of a small, trusting hand that sometimes felt like it was still tucked inside his own calloused palm. And they came at night, most often, in the deafening echo of a single gunshot that ripped the silence apart and left him gasping in his bedroll, the cold sweat of a nightmare clinging to his skin. He was a shell, hollowed out by a sorrow so vast it had its own geography, its own unforgiving landscape. He sought work that was hard enough to break his body, hoping it might finally break his mind's terrible habit of remembering. The town, when he finally reached it, was called Redemption Gulch. It was less a town and more a wound on the face of the prairie, a raw collection of unpainted timber buildings clinging to the edge of a dusty plain. A single wide street was rutted by wagon wheels and pocked with the casual cruelties of frontier life. Men with hard eyes watched him ride in, their faces shuttered, their hands never far from the pistols at their hips. It was a place where prejudice was a kind of currency, and a man's worth was measured in what he could take and what he could hold. In the saloon, which smelled of stale beer and desperation, Jack made his inquiries. He needed work. He did not care what kind. The answers were slow to come, mumbled between sips of watered-down whiskey. But one name kept surfacing, spoken with a mixture of fear and a grudging deference. Silas Croft. "Owns the Bar C," a grizzled trapper told him, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Owns near everything else, too. The land, the water, most of the men on it." "He's always hiring," another man added, his voice low. "Always losing hands, too." He did not elaborate, and Jack did not ask him to. The warnings hung in the air like cigar smoke. But Jack paid them no mind. He was not looking for a kind boss or a comfortable bunk. He was looking for oblivion, and the kind of hard labor that left no room for thinking seemed the surest path to it. A paycheck and a place to be alone with his ghosts was all he required. Silas Croft sounded like just the man to provide it. The ride out to the Bar C ranch took him through miles of Croft's land, marked by sturdy fences and herds of cattle that bore the ranch's simple, stark brand. The ranch house itself was an affront to the landscape. It was a 2-story structure of dark, imported timber, unnaturally large and imposing, a monument to a man's ego set against the humble sweep of the prairie. It had the look of a fortress, but as Jack drew closer, he saw it was a cold one, devoid of life or warmth. No smoke curled from the massive stone chimney, no flowers grew in the dusty yard. It was a house built not for living, but for owning. Silas Croft was a man in his late 50s, with a body gone to corded muscle and a face that looked as if it had been hewn from the same rock as the mountains. His eyes were the most memorable thing about him, the color of a winter river, cold and gray and moving with a depth that promised a dangerous current beneath. He stood on the porch as Jack dismounted, assessing him with a predatory stillness that made the hairs on Jack's arms stand up. "Looking for work?" Croft's voice was like gravel grinding together. "Yes, sir." "No cattle?" "I do." "Know how to follow orders?" "I do." Croft's cold eyes raked over him, lingering on the worn grip of the Colt on Jack's hip. The exhaustion etched around his eyes. He seemed to see the hollowness inside Jack and approve of it. A man with nothing left to lose was a useful tool. "You'll work from before sunup to after sundown. You'll be paid 30 a month and found. You'll keep your mouth shut and your eyes on your work. My business is my own. You ask no questions. Is that clear? Clear as water, Jack said. Good, Croft grunted. He turned and walked back into the silent, imposing house without another word. Jack stood for a moment in the oppressive quiet, feeling as though he had just sold a piece of himself he did not know he still had. It suited him just fine. The rhythm of the ranch was brutal and blessedly monotonous. Jack was in the saddle before the first hint of light stained the eastern sky, and often did not return to the bunkhouse until the stars were a brilliant, cold scatter overhead. The work was backbreaking, the sun relentless, the other hands a collection of hard, solitary men who kept their histories to themselves. Jack's silence and grim efficiency earned him a sliver of grudging respect. They could see he was a worker, and that was all that mattered. They kept their distance, though, sensing the coiled sorrow within him, the kind of deep hurt that was best left undisturbed. He ate his meals in silence, his thoughts a low, constant hum of nothing in particular, his body aching with a fatigue so profound it almost felt like peace. He saw the rigid hierarchy of the ranch, a kingdom with Silas Croft as its undisputed, tyrannical king. His word was absolute, his displeasure a palpable threat that hung over every man, every horse, every acre of his vast domain. And then there was his queen. Jack's first glimpse of Alara Croft was from a distance, across the dusty expanse of the main yard. She was moving from the main house to the small chicken coop, her steps graceful but heavy, as if she were walking against a strong current. Even from afar, he could see the rumors of Redemption Gulch made flesh. She was beautiful, with dark hair pinned up against the nape of a slender neck, and she was young, far too young for a man like Silas Croft. A palpable sadness clung to her like a shawl, weighing down her shoulders, shadowing her movements. She moved like a phantom in her own home, a silent, sorrowful presence in the cold monument her husband had built. He noticed immediately the way the others looked at her. The other ranch hands would watch her with a mixture of crude curiosity and disdain, their whispers following her like flies. Mrs. Gable, the severe, hawk-nosed housekeeper who ran the main house with an iron fist, would look upon her mistress with an expression of open contempt. Jack heard the bunkhouse talk. She was a mail-order bride from back east, a city girl with soft hands and a past she was clearly hiding. They speculated on what kind of trouble would make a woman like her sell herself to a man like Silas Croft. They saw her as tainted, an unwelcome complication in the stark, simple world of the ranch. But it was the cradle that drew Jack's attention and held it captive. It was a simple thing, made of dark-stained wood, and Alara kept it near her at all times. If she sat on the porch for a moment of peace, the cradle was beside her. If she moved through the house, the cradle was carried with a careful, protective grace. The baby within was a mystery. Its cries were rare and always seemed muffled, as if she were desperately trying to conceal its very existence from the harsh judgment of the world. For Jack, the sight of that cradle was not a curiosity. It was a physical blow, a fist to the gut that stole his breath. It was almost identical to the one he had built for his son, Daniel. He could still feel the slide of the wood under his plane, the satisfaction of the tight joints, the smell of the linseed oil he had used to finish it. He remembered the pride on his wife Anna's face when he had presented it to her, and the gentle way she had laid their newborn son within its smooth, rocking confines. The memory was so vivid, so complete, it almost brought him to his knees right there in the dust of the corral. From that moment on, he began to watch Alara Croft differently. He no longer saw her with the detached curiosity of the other men. He watched her with a dawning, painful empathy that chipped away at the wall of numbness he had so carefully constructed. He saw the fierce, quiet protection in the way her hand always rested on the cradle's edge. He saw her profound isolation, a loneliness that mirrored his own. And he saw her silent endurance of Silas's treatment. The tension in the Croft household was a constant, low hum, the air thick with things unsaid and resentments barely contained. Silas treated his young wife like another one of his prized possessions. Some evenings, when visitors came, He would parade her, forcing her into a fine dress and making her stand beside him, a beautiful object to be admired. On those nights, his hand would rest possessively on her waist, his words to her laced with a cloying sweetness that was more threatening than any shout. More often, though, he simply ignored her existence, speaking over her as if she were a piece of furniture, his silence a weapon of dismissal. Jack, from the periphery, became an unwilling witness to the man's casual cruelty. He saw Silas take a letter from the mail pouch, open it, and read it with a sneer before tossing it into Alara's lap. He was there one evening when Silas, in front of Mrs. Gable, loudly criticized the supper she had prepared, comparing it unfavorably to his first wife's cooking, a deliberate barb designed to wound. Jack saw these moments, these small, constant acts of psychological erosion, and watched Alara absorb them with a stillness that was both heartbreaking and magnificent. Each little cruelty was a stone, and he was watching her slowly drown beneath their weight. And with each stone that fell upon her, a chip was knocked loose from his own carefully constructed wall. The end of it, or perhaps the beginning, came on a cool evening in late autumn. A restless wind swept down from the high country, carrying the first real chill of the coming winter. It moaned around the corners of the big house and kicked up dust devils in the yard. Jack was walking back to the bunkhouse, his shoulders slumped with the familiar ache of a long day's work, his clothes and skin coated in a uniform layer of grime. He saw her on the wide, dark porch. Alara was sitting in a rocking chair, a small basket of mending in her lap. The dark wood cradle was beside her, and she rocked it with a gentle, absent motion of her foot. The faint lantern light from a nearby window cast her face in soft relief, and in the unguarded moment, Jack saw an expression of sorrow so profound it felt like looking into a mirror. It was the same hollowed-out grief that resided in his own chest, a quiet, constant ache for a world that no longer existed. She seemed lost in her thoughts, a lonely silhouette against the encroaching dark. Just as Jack drew parallel to the porch steps, a sudden, sharp gust of wind whipped across the yard. It caught the corner of the small wool blanket covering the cradle, flipping it back and exposing the contents to the biting air. He did not think. He did not consider his place, or the consequences, or the silent rules of the Croft Ranch. He acted on an instinct buried so deep he had thought it long dead. The muscle memory of a father, of a husband who had once tucked in his own child against the night chill, took over. He took a single, unconscious step up onto the porch, his hand reaching out to pull the blanket back into place. He was only a foot away from the cradle, his hand hovering over the edge, when her head snapped up. "Don't touch the cradle!" Her voice was not loud, it was not a shout, but it cut through the sound of the moaning wind with the sharp, desperate authority of shattering glass. It was a sound of pure, visceral command, born not of anger but of something far deeper. Jack froze, his hand suspended in midair. He looked from the simple wooden cradle to her face. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, were locked on his, and in their depths, he saw no anger, no indignation at his trespass. He saw a raw, primal terror that went beyond the simple act of a stranger nearing a child. In that one unguarded, fearful moment, he saw everything. He saw the ghost of a lost love she was protecting. He saw the crushing weight of a solemn promise she was desperate to keep. He saw a secret so monumental it threatened to destroy her. And in her terror, he saw the perfect, horrifying reflection of his own soul-deep agony. He saw the endless, echoing failure of his own inability to protect his family. The world seemed to narrow to the small, charged space between them, a silent chasm filled with a shared, unspoken grief. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand to his side. His eyes held hers for a long second, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. Then, without a word, he turned and backed away, stepping off the porch and retreating into the darkness from which he had come. He had seen her past, her fear, her burden, and in doing so, he had been forced to stand face to face with his own. The connection between them was forged in that silent, terrifying moment, an irrevocable bond of shared sorrow. Nothing would ever be the same. The moment on the porch had changed the very air they breathed. It was now thick with unspoken things, charged with the energy of a secret shared. In the days that followed, Jack and Alara became experts in the art of avoidance. They would alter their paths to keep from crossing in the main yard. Their eyes would meet the ground, the sky, the distant mountains, anywhere but each other. Yet this deliberate distance was a language all its own. It was a shared acknowledgement of the line that had been crossed in the lantern light, a silent pact to protect the dangerous truth that had been revealed in a flash of terror. For Jack, the change was seismic. The carefully constructed wall of apathy he had hidden behind for years had been irrevocably shattered. He could no longer look upon Alara Croft as simply the boss's young, sad wife. He now saw her as she was, a fellow survivor waging a private, desperate war in the heart of enemy territory. His senses, once dulled by grief, sharpened. He became a deliberate observer, his gaze missing nothing. He began to catalog the 1,000 small cruelties Silas inflicted on his wife. A campaign of psychological warfare so subtle it was invisible to anyone not looking for it. He was mending a bridle near the main house one afternoon when the mail rider came. He saw Silas take the pouch, saw him pull out a single letter with delicate, feminine handwriting, and saw the cold smile that touched his lips as he broke the seal. Silas read the letter slowly, his expression a mixture of contempt and satisfaction, before walking over to where Alara was weeding a small, struggling herb garden. He did not hand it to her. He tossed it onto the dirt at her feet. "More lies from your city friends, I imagine," he said, his voice loud enough for Jack to hear, before turning and walking away. Jack watched Alara stare at the soiled envelope for a long moment before picking it up, her movements stiff with a control that was more painful to watch than any outburst. Another time, at the midday meal, which the hands sometimes took at a long table behind the main house, Silas began to speak of his late first wife, Martha. He lauded her skill in the kitchen, her thriftiness, her robust health, all while looking directly at Alara, who was quietly eating a piece of bread. Martha's biscuits, Silas declared to the table, could make a man weep with joy. These, he said, picking one from the basket and dropping it onto his plate with a thud, are more likely to break a man's tooth. The other hands shuffled their feet and focused on their food, but Jack saw the faint blush that crept up Alara's neck, the tightening of her jaw as she absorbed the public humiliation without a word. And he saw the physical assertions of ownership. A hand on her arm, gripping just a little too tightly to steer her through a doorway. A finger pressed hard against her lips to silence her when she began to speak out of turn. None of it was a beating. None of it would leave a mark that an outsider could point to and name as abuse. But Jack, now attuned to the frequency of her suffering, saw it for what it was, a slow, methodical grinding down of a person's soul. He saw her absorb every hurt, every insult, every small act of possession with a quiet, heartbreaking stoicism that spoke of a will to survive that was as strong as it was solitary. He was not the only one watching. Alara, in turn, had begun to observe the quiet, haunted cowboy who worked for her husband. In the moment he had reached for the cradle, she had seen something in his eyes that no other man on the ranch possessed. It was not the crude lust of the other hands, nor the cold judgment of Mrs. Gable. It was pain, a pain so deep and familiar it was like looking at her own reflection in a dark pool of water. She understood that his gesture had not been one of aggression, but of instinct, a ghost of a kindness from a life he had lost. And so, she began to test the waters of this fragile, unspoken alliance. One afternoon, during a stretch of weather so hot and dry the very air seemed to crackle, Jack was sent to mend a long stretch of fence on the ranch's western edge, a lonely task miles from the main house. The sun was a hammer, beating down relentlessly. Around midday, he saw a figure walking out from the homestead. It was Alara, the baby secured against her chest in a sling, ostensibly out for a stroll. though no sane person would choose to walk in that heat. She did not approach him directly. Instead, she veered towards a cluster of fence posts about 50 yards from where he was working. She stopped there for a moment, adjusted the baby's bonnet, and then turned and walked back the way she came. When Jack, his throat parched and his head aching from the sun, finally walked over to the spot, he found a large clay jug of cool water left in the sliver of shade cast by a post. It was a simple, profound gift, offered and received in complete silence. A week later, he found another such message. A pair of his thick leather work gloves had developed a tear along the seam of the thumb, a common enough annoyance. He had left them slung over his saddle horn one evening. The next morning, when he went to the corral, they were still there, but the seam had been repaired. The stitches were small, neat, and precise, a testament to a skill and patience that was utterly foreign to the rough world of the bunkhouse. He ran his thumb over the tidy thread, a silent acknowledgement of the care that had been taken. These were small, dangerous gestures of kindness, secret transmissions that spoke volumes in their silent world. They were Ilara's way of saying, "I see you, too." The dry spell tightened its grip on the territory. The vast sea of grass turned a brittle, uniform brown. The earth cracked like old pottery. The creeks shrank to muddy trickles, and the cattle grew thin and agitated, their ribs showing through their hides. The relentless sun and oppressive heat seemed to magnify the suffocating atmosphere of the Croft Ranch. Tempers among the hands grew short, fraying as easily as old rope. Silas's mood, always sour, curdled with the landscape. He became a tyrant, his voice a constant, angry bark, his presence a dark cloud that promised no relief. Then the sky broke. The change came with a sudden, violent fury. The brass-colored sky of late afternoon bruised to a dark purple gray. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. The first drops were huge, splattering in the dust like coins. Then the heavens opened. Lightning split the sky, followed by peals of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. A torrential rain hammered the iron-hard ground, turning the dry creek beds into raging, muddy torrents within minutes. Silas, seeing the storm coming, had ridden out with most of the hands. They were in a desperate race against the elements, trying to prevent a catastrophic stampede and move the main herd to the relative safety of higher ground. The main homestead was left nearly deserted, with only a young, green ranch hand named Billy and the formidable Mrs. Gable holding the fort. And in the main barn, a prized mare, heavy with foal, chose that moment to go into a difficult, life-threatening labor. Billy, sent to check on her, found the animal in deep distress, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with pain and terror. He was useless, a boy of 17 who had never seen a horse birth, let alone a complicated one. He ran to the main house, his face pale with panic. Mrs. Gable, practical and unsentimental, sized up the situation at once. She sent the boy stumbling back out into the deluge. "Find Mrs. Croft," she commanded. "She is the only other one here." Ilara, alerted by the panicked boy, found the mare in a bad way. The foal was breached, a single hoof presented where a head should be. She knew from a childhood spent trailing after her father that this was a death sentence for both mother and child if something was not done quickly. She also knew she could not save them alone. In a moment of sharp, clear decision, her own fears pushed aside by the urgency of the crisis, she turned to the trembling boy. "Go to the North Corral," she ordered, her voice cutting through his panic. "The man working there, Jack Thorne. Fetch him. Tell him I need him now." Jack was trying to secure a corral gate that had been torn from its leather hinges by the wind when Billy found him, soaked to the skin and babbling about the mare. Jack did not hesitate. He ran through the driving rain, the mud sucking at his boots, his heart pounding with a nameless dread. He burst through the main barn doors into a scene of contained chaos. The storm raged outside, a symphony of thunder and wind and drumming rain that sealed the barn off from the rest of the world. Inside, a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of wet hay, animal fear, and the storm. Ilara was there, her back to him, her voice low and calm as she tried to soothe the terrified, groaning animal. Her fine dress was already stained with mud and sweat, a dark strand of hair plastered to her cheek. She was no longer the phantom of the main house. She was a woman facing a crisis with a steady nerve he would not have believed possible. What followed was a long, grueling night spent at the precipice between life and death. The vast, empty space of the ranch shrank to the confines of that lantern-lit stall. They were forced to work together, their bodies brushing against each other as they maneuvered in the tight space, their hands meeting as they handled wet ropes and soft cloths. All distance, all pretense, was stripped away by the raw, elemental struggle. Jack's years of experience with livestock and Alara's surprising, deep-seated knowledge created a seamless, unspoken partnership. They communicated with grunts, nods, and single words, their actions guided by a shared instinct and a desperate, singular purpose. The scene was visceral and intense, the mare's pained cries, the rhythmic, relentless drumming of the rain on the roof, the slick feel of sweat on their own skin. Against all odds, as the storm outside began to exhaust its fury, they succeeded. With a final, heroic effort from the mare and their combined strength, the foal was born, slick and steaming in the cool air. They worked together to clear its airway, to rub it down with rough burlap sacks until its spindly legs began to twitch with life. They had done it. They had saved them both. As the first, watery light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the barn walls, the rain subsided to a gentle patter. They stood in the quiet aftermath, exhausted, splattered with blood and filth, breathing in the clean, earthy scent of new life. The shared ordeal had burned away the last of their defenses. They were no longer the boss's wife and the hired hand. They were simply a man and a woman who had fought a battle together and won. The fragile peace of the new morning held the emotional climax of their story so far. Wordlessly, they collapsed onto a pile of clean hay near the stall, the newborn foal stirring nearby, its mother nickering softly. Jack looked at Alara, truly looked at her, as if for the first time. He saw past the sorrow and the fear to the core of unbreakable strength beneath. The silence stretched, comfortable and profound. He finally broke it, his voice rough with exhaustion and something more. "You're good at this," he said. It was a simple statement, but it was filled with a respect he had not offered to anyone in a very long time. She looked down at her stained hands, then met his gaze. A flicker of another life, another world, crossed her face. "My father was a veterinarian," she said softly. "Before." She trailed off, the single word hanging in the air, heavy with its own unspoken tragedy. He did not push. He understood the territory of things left unsaid. Another long silence settled between them, filled now with the weight of her partial confession. Finally, he asked the question that had been haunting him since that evening on the porch, a question that now felt both necessary and incredibly dangerous. "Are you all right, Mrs. Croft?" She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the tears that were always swimming behind her eyes well up and threaten to fall. She fought them back, but her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, stripped of all pretense. "No," she said, "I'm not." It was a simple, devastating admission, the first time, he suspected, that she had ever voiced the true depth of her despair to another living soul. The confession hung in the air between them, a testament of absolute trust, a fragile thing offered in the exhausted peace of the dawn. Jack felt a powerful, overwhelming urge to reach out, to close the small distance between them and offer some physical comfort. But he clenched his fists in the hay, the impulse warring with a lifetime of practiced restraint. Instead of his hand, he offered her a piece of his own brokenness, a confession in kind. "I lost a foal once," he said, his gaze turning inward to a memory of fire and smoke. "In a fire," he paused, the words catching in his throat. "Lost, more than the foal." He did not need to say more. In the quiet of the barn, with the new life they had just saved breathing softly beside them, she understood. They had finally spoken the same language, the raw, desolate language of loss. Their alliance was no longer a thing of silent glances and secret gestures. It was sealed in shared vulnerability, forged in the storm, and baptized in the acknowledgement of their mutual heartbreaking pain. The night in the barn had drawn a new, invisible line in the dust of the Bar C ranch. On one side was the life they had known before, a life of separate, silent suffering. On the other was a shared existence, a fragile and dangerous intimacy that hummed between Jack and Alara like a taut wire. The vastness of the ranch, which had once offered Jack a semblance of anonymity, now felt small and constricting. Every corner, every shadow, seemed charged with their heightened awareness of each other. The sight of her walking from the house to the well could make his breath catch. A glimpse of him riding in from the range, weary and dust-covered, could make her heart hammer against her ribs. They began to engineer moments to be alone, brief, stolen interludes fraught with a risk that only sharpened their necessity. It was never planned, not in words, but in a shared, instinctive understanding. If Jack was tasked with watering the horses at the creek that snaked through the lower pasture, Alara might find a reason to walk that way, the baby in her arms, ostensibly to gather wild mint from the banks. They would exchange a few low words, their conversation circling the weather, the health of the new foal, anything but the truth that pulsed between them. Their eyes, however, told a different story, speaking of a shared burden and a dawning, desperate hope. In the evenings, as twilight bled across the sky, a word could be exchanged in the deep shadow of the barn, their shoulders brushing in the near darkness, a contact that felt as momentous as a vow. These were not the sweet, reckless meetings of young lovers. They were the desperate communiques of allies trapped deep in enemy territory. The air between them was thick with a current that was more than simple attraction. It was a profound hunger for solace, the desperate yearning of two drowning people who had found a single, fragile piece of driftwood to cling to in a vast and merciless sea. They saw in each other a sanctuary from the loneliness that had defined their lives. But Silas Croft was not a foolish man. His wealth and power had been built on his ability to read the subtle shifts in the landscape, in his cattle, and in the men who worked for him. He began to notice the change. It was in the way his wife carried herself. The resigned, defeated slump of her shoulders had been replaced by a new straightness in her spine. He saw a light flicker in her eyes that had not been there before, a spark of defiance where once there had been only quiet compliance. He saw it in the cowboy. Thorn, as well. He noticed the way the man's gaze would find Alara and linger for a fraction of a second too long, a look devoid of the crude interest of the other hands, a look that was deeper, more knowing, and infinitely more threatening. The paranoia that was a constant, grumbling undercurrent in Silas's nature began to rise to the surface. He started to test them, to pull at the invisible wire that connected them, to see if it would snap. He began by assigning Jack the most grueling, isolated tasks on the ranch. He was sent to repair fences in the far northern pastures, a job that would keep him away from the main homestead for days at a time. He was tasked with clearing mesquite from a rocky canyon, a solitary, back-breaking job under a punishing sun. The message was clear: stay away from the house, stay away from my wife. For Alara, the change was more direct. Her limited freedom was curtailed entirely. Silas forbade her from leaving the main house and its immediate yard without Mrs. Gable as a chaperone. The severe housekeeper became her shadow, her hawk-like eyes missing nothing, her silent presence a constant, suffocating reminder of her status as a prisoner. Silas's cruelty, once a thing of subtle barbs and private dismissals, became more pointed, more public. At supper one evening, he loudly commented on how a wife's primary duty was to provide her husband with an heir, his cold eyes fixed on Alara's face, the unspoken accusation of her barrenness hanging over the table like a shroud. His actions were no longer those of a husband, but of a jailer methodically tightening the bars on a cage. His efforts had the opposite effect. The separation, the heightened scrutiny, only made their stolen moments more precious, their need for connection more urgent. One afternoon, Jack was returning from a 3-day stint in the high country. He led his weary horse not to the main corral, but to the small copse of cottonwood trees that grew by the creek, a place hidden from the direct sightline of the main house. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that she would be there. And she was. Alara sat on a fallen log, the cradle at her feet, the baby, Lily, sleeping soundly in her arms. She had known he was due back, and she had taken the one path from the house that Mrs. Gable could not easily observe. She had decided, in the long, lonely hours of the preceding days, that she could not bear the crushing weight of her secret alone any longer. She had to trust him, completely. He tethered his horse and walked toward her, the weariness of the trail falling away as he got closer. He did not speak, simply sat on the log a few feet from her, the quiet of the cottonwoods a welcome balm. "I was beginning to think you were not coming back," she said, her voice soft. "He pays my wages," Jack answered, his own voice rough from disuse. "I go where he sends me." She looked down at the sleeping child in her arms, her fingers gently stroking the baby's fine, dark hair. "I have to tell you something, Jack," she said, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it, spoken in her voice, was both strange and deeply familiar. "I cannot carry it by myself anymore." The story came tumbling out of her then, a torrent of grief and fear that had been dammed up for too long. "Lily is not my daughter," she began, the words a painful whisper. "She is my niece, my sister's child." Jack listened, his expression unreadable, his body perfectly still, his attention an absolute, unwavering gift. Alara spoke of her younger sister, Clara, a girl full of life and a foolish, romantic heart. She had fallen in love with a man in the city back east, a man who was handsome, charismatic, from a family of great wealth and power. He had promised her everything. But when Clara told him she was with child, he had vanished, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Their family, rigid and unforgiving, had disowned her, casting her out to protect their own good name. "Clara had nowhere to go," Alara said, tears now tracking silently down her cheeks. "She died a week after Lily was born. The fever took her, but before she went, she made me swear an oath. She made me promise I would protect her baby, her father's family. They are ruthless people. Jack, Clara was terrified of them. She said they would either hide Lily away in some institution to avoid a scandal or worse." She choked on the word, unable to voice the darkest of her sister's fears. "Becoming a mail-order bride was a desperate gamble," she continued, her voice gaining a thread of steel. "I had to disappear. I had to find a place so remote, so far from their world, that they would never find us. I had to give Lily a new life, a new name, a father who could protect her. I saw Mr. Croft's advertisement in the paper. He wrote of his vast lands, his standing in the community. I thought," her voice broke, "I thought he would be a shield. I knew nothing of his true nature. I feel as though I have failed my sister completely. I led us from one cage straight into another, more terrifying one." She fell silent, her confession laid bare between them in the dappled sunlight. Jack remained quiet for a long time, processing the weight of her words. The revelation recontextualized everything. Her fierce, almost frantic protection of the cradle, the raw terror in her eyes that first night on the porch, her profound isolation. It was not just her own life she was fighting for. It was the life of this innocent child, and the sanctity of a dying sister's last wish. He was looking at a courage so profound it humbled him. He was moved by her trust, and horrified by the trap she was in. And he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that he could no longer keep his own ghosts locked away. She had offered him her truth. He owed her nothing less than his own. "Before I was this," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "I had a life, back in Texas." He told her about his wife, Anna. He spoke of her laughter, which he said sounded like wind chimes, and the stubborn way she planted wildflowers around their small homestead, coaxing color from the hard, dry soil. He described his son, Daniel, a bright, curious boy of 5 with his mother's eyes and a love for chasing grasshoppers through the tall summer grass. He spoke of a life that felt as distant and unreal as a dream. And then he told her how it had ended. He spoke of a raid, a desperate band of Comanche driven by hunger and a summer of failed hunts. His voice grew flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "I was away," he said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the creek, checking a fence line on the far side of our property. It was a small break, a task that could have waited a day or a week. The guilt, the constant, corrosive companion of his years, was thick in his voice. "When I came back, the house was on fire. The smoke, I could see it for miles." He stopped, swallowing hard against the memory that was as vivid as if it were yesterday. "They were gone. Anna, Daniel, all of it." He looked at Alara then, his eyes dark with a pain so old and deep it seemed bottomless. "I found the cradle, the one I built for him. It was overturned in the yard, near the ashes of the house." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Beside it was a small wooden horse I had carved for his 5th birthday. It was charred and broken." He took a ragged breath. "My failure to be there, to protect them, that is the sin I can never outrun. It is the reason I am here. It is the reason I am what I am." Their confessions had stripped them bare. They were no longer the mysterious cowboy and the tragic bride. They were Jackson and Alara, 2 people defined by love, loss, and the weight of impossible promises. They sat in the quiet of the cottonwood grove, surrounded by the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. 2 islands of grief that had finally, against all odds, drifted together to form a single, sorrowful shore. The air between them was immense, a heavy, palpable thing made of shared sorrow, a profound empathy, and a fierce, burgeoning tenderness that was both terrifying and beautiful. The moment stretched, held in the fragile space their honesty had created. Alara, her eyes shining with unshed tears for his loss as much as her own, slowly reached out. Her fingers, hesitant at first, gently touched the thick, ragged scar on his forearm, a long-ago reminder of a run-in with a strand of barbed wire. It was a simple, innocent touch, but it carried the entire weight of all they had just shared, a recognition of his pain, an offering of comfort, a bridge across the chasm of their solitude. Jack looked down at her small, trembling hand on his arm, then slowly lifted his gaze to her eyes. He saw his own grief reflected there, but he also saw something else, a strength, a compassion, a spark of life that he thought had been extinguished from the world forever. And in that instant, the last of his carefully constructed control, the discipline of years spent in emotional exile, crumbled into dust. He leaned in, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not sweet or tentative. It was a collision, a desperate and immediate claiming. It was a kiss fueled by years of solitude and the raw agony of their shared grief. It was the terrifying, beautiful spark of hope they saw in each other's eyes taking flame. It was the desperate gasp for air of a drowning man who has finally found the surface. It tasted of trail dust, of salt from the tears on her cheeks, and of the bitter, undeniable truth of their impossible situation. In that moment, they were not hiding. They were not stealing. They were staking a claim on each other's pain, offering a sanctuary that was as necessary as it was dangerous. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. They pulled apart, breathing heavily, the sound loud in the quiet grove. The world had irrevocably changed. The wire between them had been pulled taut, and it had not snapped. It now hummed with a new, perilous current. They were no longer just allies. They were accomplices. Their love a secret that could either be their salvation or the very thing that would get them killed. That single, desperate kiss in the cottonwood grove redrew the map of their world. The stolen moments they engineered were no longer just for the quiet solace of shared understanding. They were now charged with a fierce, forbidden passion that was as terrifying as it was vital. Their love, now spoken in the silent language of a shared glance. A brief touch of hands over a saddle blanket became a secret beacon of light in the oppressive darkness of their lives. But for every watt of light it cast, it threw a longer, more dangerous shadow. Every quiet conversation was a gamble, every fleeting moment of connection a roll of the dice with their very lives as the stake. For the first time in years, the word future entered their vocabularies. It was a foreign, fragile word, spoken in whispers when they were certain no one could hear. The idea of escape, once a distant, impossible fantasy, began to take shape in the darkness, hardening from a dream into a tangible, necessary goal. They spoke of it in fragments, piecing together a plan from scraps of hope and desperation, a life somewhere else, somewhere they were not owned, somewhere they could be a family. This fragile possibility became the center of their universe, the thing that allowed them to endure the daily, grinding reality of the bar sea. Silas Croft's suspicion, a slow-burning ember, was fanned by their newfound hope into a roaring fire of certainty. He did not need proof. He did not need to catch them in an embrace. He felt it in the very air of the ranch. He felt the invisible current that flowed between his wife and his hired hand, a bond that pointedly excluded and silently defied him. He saw the way she no longer flinched from his gaze but met it with a quiet, unnerving stillness. He saw the way the cowboy, Thorne, now carried himself with a dangerous new purpose. He decided, with the cold finality of a man accustomed to breaking things, that he would shatter their bond, and them along with it. He began with humiliation. He had invited several influential neighbors for supper, cattlemen and a land agent whose favor he was courting. Ilara, dressed in a simple dark gown, moved silently around the table, serving the food, her face a pale, composed mask. Jack was not present. Of course, he was in the bunkhouse with the other hands, but he was there in spirit, the unseen audience for whom Silas's performance was truly intended. Towards the end of the meal, Silas stood, raising his whiskey glass. A cruel smile played on his lips. "A toast," he boomed, his voice filling the tense silence of the dining room. He let his gaze drift over his guests before settling, with deliberate, theatrical weight, on his wife. "To Mrs. Croft, who has blessed my home with her beauty, if not with children." He paused, letting the insult land. "Perhaps her barrenness is God's own punishment for past sins. We can only pray she finds a way to cleanse her soul and fulfill her wifely duty." He drank deeply, his eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, flicking towards the window that faced the corrals, as if he could bore a hole through the darkness and pin Jack to the wall with his stare. The message was as clear as a gunshot. It was designed to shame Ilara, to remind her of her dependency and her perceived failings, and to warn Jack that he was trespassing on the property of a powerful and unforgiving man. Ilara endured it. Her face remained a stony, expressionless canvas, but a single, betraying muscle twitched in her jaw. When Jack heard about the toast later from one of the other hands, a man who recounted it with a sort of horrified glee, he did not speak. He simply walked out of the bunkhouse and stood for a long time staring at the main house, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles showing white in the moonlight. The psychological warfare soon escalated to physical violence. Convinced he needed to reassert his absolute dominance, to remind everyone on the ranch of the brutal consequences of defiance, Silas created a pretext. A week-old calf, already weak from a difficult birth, succumbed to a fever and died. It was a common enough occurrence on a ranch this size, but Silas turned it into a weapon. He summoned the hands to the main corral, his face a mask of cold fury. He accused Jack, who had been responsible for the herd the calf was in, of gross negligence. "This man," Silas declared, his voice ringing with false authority, "let a valuable piece of my stock perish through his own laziness. The Bar C does not tolerate laziness." It was a blatant lie. Jack had sat up with the sick animal for 2 nights, trying to nurse it back to health, a fact several of the other hands knew. But on this ranch, Silas's word was law, and truth was whatever he decreed it to be. He nodded to two of his most loyal and thuggish ranch hands, the hulking Miller brothers, Jeb and Ike. "Teach him a lesson," Silas ordered. "A lesson in remembering who provides your keep, who owns the very ground you stand on." Jeb and Ike, both of whom had long resented Jack's quiet competence, needed no further encouragement. They dragged Jack into the center of the corral. He did not fight back in a way that would give Silas an excuse to have him shot. He simply stood, planting his feet in the dust, and prepared to endure. From the porch of the main house, Ilara was forced to watch, a silent, horrified statue, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles were white. Silas had made certain she was there. The beating was a message for her as much as it was for him. It was a brutal, methodical assault. The Miller brothers worked him over with their fists, their blows heavy and punishing. Jack absorbed the beating with a defiant stillness, his body taking the punishment, but his spirit refusing to break. He went down to one knee, a split lip pouring blood down his chin, but whenever he could focus through the haze of pain, his eyes found Ilara on the porch. Their gazes locked across the dusty expanse, a silent exchange of shared agony and unbroken resolve. He was telling her he could take it. She was telling him she understood. That night, long after the rest of the ranch had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Ilara slipped out of the main house and made her way to the barn. She carried a small basin of warm water and a bundle of clean cloths. She found Jack sitting in the hay of an empty stall, the same stall where they had saved the foal, his back against the rough-hewn wood. In the dim light of the single lantern she carried, his face was a swollen, bruised mess. The act of tending to his wounds was intimate and agonizing. She said nothing, simply knelt before him and began to gently clean the cuts on his face. Her touch was as light as a feather, but every dab of the cloth sent a jolt through him. As she cleaned a particularly nasty gash on his cheekbone, a single tear escaped her eye and fell onto his bruised skin. Then another. Soon. She was crying silently, her tears a quiet testament to the horror of the day. This was the breaking point, the last straw. In the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, they both knew, without having to say it, that they had to leave. It was no longer a question of if, but when, and the answer had to be soon. Their planning, once a thing of whispered hopes, became frantic and concrete. Jack, speaking through a swollen jaw, detailed a possible escape route. "The Badlands," he rasped. "To the east. It is a hard country, dry, but a posse will not follow us far in there. They will expect us to head north, towards the Gallatin." They began to secretly gather supplies, each small acquisition a victory, a piece of their future stolen from under Silas's nose. Ilara managed to secrete away a small stash of dried meat and a handful of biscuits from the pantry. Jack bartered a plug of tobacco he had been saving with one of the other hands, a man with a gambling debt, in exchange for a small, reliable compass. From a pile of discarded tack, Ilara salvaged a sturdy water skin, which she patched and cleaned. She took the warmest blanket from her own bed, a thick wool thing, and hid it, along with their meager provisions, in a small satchel tucked beneath her mattress. Every action was a risk, every hidden item a prayer. As they plotted their desperate escape, a new, more sinister threat arrived, a shadow falling over the already dark landscape of their lives. A stranger appeared in Redemption Gulch. He was a man who did not belong. In a town of dusty, sun-beaten men in denim and leather, he was quiet, well-dressed in dark, city-made clothes, and his eyes missed nothing. He did not drink at the saloon or engage in idle chatter. He asked a few discreet questions at the general store and the livery, questions about a young woman who had arrived in the territory with a baby a few months prior. Word of the stranger and his questions reached the ranch. When Jack heard the description, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. This was not a drifter. This was a professional, a Pinkerton agent, or a private gun for hire, sent by Lily's powerful, ruthless family. They had tracked Ilara down. The presence of this man turned their desperate situation into a frantic race against time. They were no longer just running from Silas's jealousy and cruelty. They were being hunted from two directions, caught in the closing jaws of a vice. The final, violent explosion came 2 nights later. Silas had ridden into town and had returned late, reeking of whiskey, his mood black and murderous. Perhaps he had spoken to the stranger. Perhaps the man's questions had confirmed his own festering suspicions. Whatever the trigger, the rage he had been carefully nursing finally boiled over. He stormed through the house, his heavy boots thundering on the wooden floors. He kicked open the door to Ilara's room, his face a contorted mask of fury. She was standing by the window, Lily asleep in the cradle beside her. "This is what it is all about, is it not?" he roared, his voice thick with drink and hatred. He strode across the room and grabbed the cradle, lifting it threateningly, the small wooden frame groaning under his powerful grip. "This little bastard! You think I am a fool? You think I did not know?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I have known for some time this is not your child, and now I know whose it is. Some city trash you are trying to pass off as your own." He sneered, his eyes glittering with a vicious triumph. "That well-dressed man in town has been asking about you. I think he would be very interested to meet the child. I think it is time to send it back to the filth it came from." For Silas, it was the ultimate act of control, the final, crushing assertion of his power, to take away the one thing in the world she valued more than her own life. A sound of pure, animal terror was ripped from Ilara's throat. She screamed, not a plea but a war cry, and launched herself at him, her hands clawing, fighting him for the cradle. Jack, who had been restlessly pacing near the bunkhouse, his instincts screaming that the night was about to break apart, heard that scream. He did not hesitate. He ran for the main house, bursting through the front door and taking the stairs 2 at a time. He slammed open the door to her room to see Silas with his hands on the cradle, Ilara fighting him like a wildcat, her face a blur of terror and fury. His vision went red. All the pain, all the guilt, all the rage he had suppressed for years erupted in a single, silent roar. The ensuing fight was not a stylized Western brawl. It was a brutal, desperate struggle for life. Jack hit Silas with the force of a freight train, knocking him away from the cradle. They crashed through a small table, sending a pitcher and basin shattering to the floor. Their blows were savage and clumsy, fueled by years of repressed hatred on one side and a burning, protective fury on the other. It was a fight born of Jack's guilt over the family he had failed to protect in the past, and his absolute, unshakable need to protect the future he had just begun to imagine. While they were locked in their brutal combat, Ilara, seeing her chance, acted with a speed and clarity born of pure desperation. She snatched the sleeping Lily from the cradle, grabbed the small, pre-packed satchel of supplies from under her bed, and wrapped them both in the heavy wool shawl she had laid out. The fight culminated in a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength from Jack. He slammed Silas back against the heavy, ornate bedpost of the master bed. There was a sickening crack as Silas's head connected with the dark wood. The older man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped to the floor, stunned and bleeding, but still breathing. There was no time for anything else. The sound of the fight would have alerted the whole ranch. Jack grabbed Ilara's hand, his bruised knuckles leaving a smear of blood on her skin. Together, their eyes locked in a shared, frantic understanding. They fled the room. They did not stop for horses, knowing that the corral would be the first place the other hands would look. They ran on foot, out the back of the house, plunging into the inky darkness and the biting wind of the open prairie. And as they ran, the first, soft flakes of an early, unseasonable snowstorm began to fall from the black sky. A silent, swirling curtain that might be their only chance of covering their tracks and vanishing into the night. The snowstorm that had been their salvation now became their tormentor. It had swallowed their tracks, providing a precious head start, but now it sought to swallow them whole. The world beyond a few feet in any direction ceased to exist, erased by a swirling, blinding curtain of white. The vast, open prairie became a claustrophobic prison. The wind, a physical predator that clawed at their clothes, stole the breath from their lungs, and drove the temperature to a life-threatening, bone-deep cold. Landmarks vanished. The sun was a forgotten memory. Their entire world shrank to the crunch of their own boots in the snow. The next desperate step, the next gust of wind, the constant, consuming need for warmth. Their flight was a grueling ordeal painted in shades of white and gray. Jack, his body a symphony of aches from the beating he had taken, pushed forward, taking the lead. He drew on a deep well of knowledge of the land, reading the subtle inclines of the terrain, the shapes of the wind-blasted rocks, searching for any fold in the earth that might offer a moment's respite. His every movement was an act of will, a battle against the pain that radiated from his ribs and the exhaustion that threatened to pull him down into the snow and let him sleep forever. Behind him, a few steps, followed Alara. She was a study in fierce, maternal determination, her body curved around the precious bundle in her arms. She clutched Lily tightly to her chest, the infant's small warmth a tiny, flickering candle against the immense, encroaching cold. They were fugitives, stripped of everything that had once defined them. They had only the clothes on their backs, a small satchel with a handful of dried meat, a half-full water skin, and the compass that was their only link to a world beyond the storm. They had each other. Dialogue became a luxury they could not afford. Their energy was a finite resource, conserved for the singular purpose of movement. Their communication became a thing of physical gestures and shared glances. A steadying hand from Jack on Alara's arm as she stumbled over a hidden rock. A look of shared fear as a particularly violent gust of wind nearly tore them from their feet. A nod of grim understanding when they paused, gasping for breath, in the lee of a rocky outcrop. In the crucible of their journey, they learned each other's rhythms, the subtle signs of exhaustion, the flicker of doubt in the eyes, the squaring of the shoulders that meant a new reserve of strength had been found. The desperate, passionate connection that had flared between them in the cottonwood grove was transformed by the brutal reality of their flight. Love was no longer the stolen kiss, the whispered word. Love became the practical, life-sustaining acts of survival. One evening, as they huddled behind a barricade of fallen pine branches, their meager supplies spread between them. Jack took the last 2 strips of dried beef. He tore them in half and gave the larger portion to Alara. "You are eating for 2, he said, his voice a low rasp, and the argument died in her throat before it could form. Love was the silent, absolute authority in that statement. The next day, the gash on his cheek, a gift from the Miller brothers, opened up again, the cold preventing it from properly healing. Without a word, Alara stopped, sat down in the snow, and tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her petticoat. She gently cleaned the wound with a handful of snow and bound it tightly, her fingers deft and sure. Love was the sacrifice of a piece of herself to mend a piece of him. And at night, love was the desperate huddle for warmth. They would find what shelter they could, a shallow cave or a thicket of pine, and press their bodies together against the killing cold. Lily, wrapped in her thick wool blanket, would be nestled safely between them, a fragile, precious core of life. They would lie there for hours, their breath mingling in the frigid air, the shared rhythm of their breathing a silent testament to their shared will to live. Their struggle, their mutual dependency, forged a bond far deeper and more resilient than their earlier clandestine meetings ever could. This was not a stolen affection. It was a partnership forged in the heart of the wilderness, absolute and unconditional. They were constantly hunted. The narrative of their survival was punctuated by the relentless threat of their pursuers. Miles behind them, Silas Croft, his head wrapped in a stained bandage, his face a mask of vengeful fury, drove his posse onward. The Miller brothers rode beside him, their expressions sullen and brutal, their desire for retribution a palpable thing. Their pursuit was clumsy, fueled by rage and whiskey, but it was relentless. They were a force of pure, blunt hatred, determined to drag their quarry back and make an example of them. And somewhere else, moving with a chilling efficiency that was far more dangerous, was the quiet, methodical stranger from town. His name was Corrigan, and he was not driven by rage. He was a professional, and their trail, though faint, was a puzzle he was patiently solving. He understood the snow, understood the way the wind would drift it, understood the kind of shelter a desperate man would seek. While Silas's posse crashed through the landscape, Corrigan moved through it like a ghost, his progress quiet, intelligent, and terrifyingly certain. The sense of pressure was relentless, a tightening noose that they could feel even in the heart of the disorienting storm. After 3 days of relentless travel, they were on the verge of collapse. The storm had lessened its fury, but the cold remained, a constant, insidious enemy. Their food was gone. Their bodies were screaming with exhaustion and hunger, just as Alara felt she could not take another step. Jack spotted it through a break in the swirling snow, a dark shape against the white, a collapsed roofline half buried in a snowdrift. It was an abandoned prospector's shack, little more than a pile of rotting timbers and a partially intact stone chimney. But to them, it was a palace. It offered a brief respite from the wind, a place to stop moving, but little else. The single room was drafty, the floor covered in a layer of fine, dry snow that had blown in through the countless gaps in the walls. They had no wood for a fire, no food to eat. The cold was not kept out, merely blunted, and it seeped into their bones with a slow, patient finality. It was here, in this dilapidated ruin, on the edge of oblivion, that their fragile world began to truly fall apart. The constant stress, the unrelenting cold, and the lack of nourishment had taken their toll on the baby. Lily developed a fever. Her small body, which had been a source of warmth, now radiated a sickly, unnatural heat. Her breathing became shallow and ragged, each small gasp a painful effort. Her weak, whimpering cries were like shards of glass in the oppressive, frozen silence of the shack. Ilara, holding the sick child, finally broke. The magnificent stoicism that had carried her through Silas's cruelty, through the terrifying escape, through the brutal journey, shattered into a million pieces. She was consumed by a wave of despair so powerful it buckled her. She began to sob, not the silent tears she had shed in the barn, but deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. "I have failed her," she cried, her voice raw with grief and self-loathing. "Clara, I am so sorry. I promised I would keep her safe." She looked at Jack, her eyes wild with a pain he knew all too well. "I have killed us all. This was a mistake. My gamble. It was a fatal mistake. We are going to die here." She was convinced she had failed everyone, her dying sister, the innocent child in her arms, and the man who had risked everything for her. Jack, watching her, felt the crushing weight of his own past threatening to rise up and swallow him whole. The image of a sick child, the sound of a woman's weeping. It was a scene torn directly from his deepest, most haunted nightmares. The old, familiar script began to play in his head, the one where he was helpless, the one where he had failed, the one that ended in smoke and silence. But this time was different. He was not miles away, checking a fence line. He was here, and he was not helpless. He moved to her side on the cold, snow-dusted floor. He did not offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. He simply wrapped his arms around both her and the feverish child, pulling them into him, shielding them with his own body. He held them, absorbing the violent tremors of her sobs, offering his own strength, his own warmth, his own unwavering presence. He just held on, a solid rock in the flood of her despair. Slowly, her sobs subsided into exhausted, shuddering breaths. When she was quiet, he loosened his hold just enough to look her directly in the eyes. His own face was a bruised and battered landscape, but his gaze was raw, steady, and filled with a fierce conviction. "We are not done yet," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the small, cold space. I made a promise to myself a long time ago. Ilara, I promised myself that I would never have a family again, that I did not deserve one, that the best I could do was to just fade away. He took a breath, the words costing him something to say out loud. But I was wrong. He gently reached out a finger, a gesture of infinite tenderness, and touched Lily's feverish cheek. She is not just your promise to keep anymore, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked from the child back to Ilara, his gaze unwavering, profound. She is ours. The word hung in the air, momentous, transformative. We will get our daughter through this, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a vow spoken in the heart of desolation. I swear it. His use of those words, our daughter, was a profound turning point, a seismic shift in the landscape of their souls. For Jack, it was the full, unconditional acceptance of a future he thought had been burned to ashes years ago. It was a commitment that transcended the simple need for survival. It was a promise of a new life, a new beginning, a new family. For Ilara, hearing those words in her moment of deepest, blackest despair was a lifeline. It was a hand reaching for her in the darkness, pulling her back from the abyss. The vow, spoken with such certainty in the face of what seemed like certain death, rekindled a flicker of hope that had been all but extinguished. In the heart of the desolate, frozen wilderness, they had formally become a family, bound not by blood or by law, but by a shared promise made in the face of oblivion. And with that promise, they found the strength to face whatever came next. The vow, spoken in the frozen silence of the shack, was a spark of warmth against the encroaching dark. But that glimmer of hope was to be immediately and brutally tested. As the gray light of dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Jack, peering through a crack in the rotting timbers, saw the first signs of movement on a distant ridge. The trackers were closing in. He watched for a long time, his body tense, and saw two distinct groups. One was a clumsy, dark cluster of riders, moving with the angry impatience he recognized as Silas's posse. The other was a lone figure, moving with a quiet, methodical grace that was infinitely more terrifying. It was the man from town, Corrigan, and he was not with Silas. He was tracking them independently, his path more certain, his progress more deadly. The abandoned shack, their temporary sanctuary, had officially become a trap. There was no more running. Jack knew it in his bones. In their weakened state, with a sick child, they would be run down in the open within an hour. He had to make a stand. Here. Now. Using the rugged terrain around the shack as his ally, he prepared a desperate defense. A jumble of snow-dusted boulders a short distance from the shack offered a clear line of sight to the two main approaches. It was a natural choke point, a place where the odds, while still impossibly long, might shift just enough. It was not a fortress, but it was a place where a single, determined man might have a fighting chance. His only weapon was the old revolver he had taken from the ranch house in their flight. He checked it. 4 rounds, 4 chances to buy his family a future. He turned to Ilara, his bruised face set in grim lines. The plan he laid out was simple, and in his own mind, suicidal. He would hold them off from the rocks. She was to take Lily, and what little strength she had left, and use the cover of the fight to get over the next ridge. Just keep moving east, he told her, his voice low and urgent. Do not look back. Ilara looked from his determined face to the sleeping, feverish child in her arms. The timid, frightened bride she had once been was gone forever, burned away by hardship and a love she would not relinquish. She shook her head, a single, sharp motion. No, she said. The argument that followed was quiet, but as fierce as any storm. You have to, Jack insisted. It is the only way. The only way for you to die alone, she countered, her voice trembling but unbroken. I will not run and leave you to be slaughtered. We started this together. Jack, we finish it together. He looked into her eyes and saw a resolve that matched his own. She was no longer a person to be protected, but a partner to be fought alongside. They decided to face the coming storm together. Ilara's role was to stay hidden in the deepest recess of the shack, keeping Lily quiet and warm. She held the small hunting knife she had taken from the kitchen, its blade a sliver of cold comfort. It was a weapon of last resort, a final, desperate line of defense for her child, for their child. Silas's posse arrived first, just as Jack had anticipated. Their approach was clumsy and loud, their voices carrying on the still, cold air, their horses struggling in the deep snow. The Miller brothers, Jeb and Ike, rode in the lead, their faces flushed with a brutish overconfidence. They saw the shack and spurred their horses forward, riding directly into the choke point Jack had chosen. The ensuing gunfight was a chaotic, brutal explosion of sound in the winter silence. Jack, tucked behind the largest of the boulders, used his cover and his 4 precious rounds with the grim wisdom of a man with nothing to lose. The first shot took Jeb Miller's horse out from under him, sending the big man crashing into a snowdrift. The second caught Ike in the shoulder, a blow that spun him half out of the saddle. Screaming in pain and rage, the remaining 2 ranch hands, seeing the fight was not the easy turkey shoot they had expected, pulled back, taking cover and returning fire wildly. Their bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Jack, sending chips of stone and ice flying. But during the chaos of the exchange, Silas, his head still bandaged, his face a mask of pure hatred, had dismounted. Using the noise of the gunfight as cover, he circled wide, moving through a stand of snow-laden pines, his movements cunning and silent. Just as Jack risked a glance to check on the retreating riders, a dark shape launched itself at him from the side. Silas tackled him with the force of a maddened bull, and the 2 men went down. Their final confrontation not a duel of pistols, but a primal, hand-to-hand struggle in the snow. It was a battle of pure, undiluted hatred. Silas screamed, his words a torrent of vitriol about betrayal, about his property being stolen from him, about the shame Jack had brought upon his name. Jack did not waste his breath on words. He fought with the silent, desperate fury of a man protecting his last reason to live, his blows fueled by a love that was as fierce as his opponent's hate. They grappled in the snow, a clumsy, savage dance of violence. Silas, with his greater weight and a body hardened by a lifetime of brutality, gained the upper hand. He pinned Jack's shoulders to the ground, his knees digging into Jack's bruised ribs. He smiled, a terrible, triumphant grin, and pulled a large hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. He raised it high, the polished steel glinting in the cold morning light, preparing for the final, killing blow. At that exact moment, Alara emerged from the shack. She had seen Silas's flanking maneuver, had watched with a heart full of ice as he had crept through the trees. With a cry that was part rage and part terror, she lunged forward, her feet sinking in the snow, the small hunting knife held tight in her hand. She threw her entire weight behind the blow, plunging the small blade into Silas's side, just below his ribs. The blow was not immediately fatal, but it was shocking and excruciatingly painful. Silas screamed, a high, strangled sound of agony and surprise, and his grip on Jack loosened. The distraction was all Jack needed. With a surge of adrenaline, he shoved Silas off him, rolling away, gasping for air. But before anyone could react further, before another blow could be struck, a single, clean gunshot echoed through the valley. It was sharp, loud, and utterly final. Silas, who had been staggering to his feet, clutching his bleeding side, jerked as if struck by lightning. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. His eyes went wide with a final, ultimate surprise. He collapsed backward into the snow and did not move again. Jack and Alara looked up, their breath misting in the frigid air. On the nearby ridge, standing as still as a statue, was Corrigan. A thin curl of smoke rose from the barrel of the rifle in his hands. He began to walk down the slope slowly, his expression utterly impassive. The surviving members of Silas's posse, seeing their leader dead and a new, more formidable threat before them, did not hesitate. They wheeled their horses around and fled, disappearing back the way they had come. Jack scrambled to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He grabbed Ilara's arm and pulled her behind him, placing his own battered body between her and the approaching stranger. They were exhausted, wounded, and had no more fight left in them. They could only wait. Corrigan stopped a few feet away. He looked at the dead man in the snow, then at Jack's bruised face, and finally, his gaze settled on Ilara, who was clutching the now crying Lily to her chest. "My employer wanted the child," Corrigan said, his voice flat and devoid of any discernible emotion. "He did not want a scandal. He instructed me to be discreet." He gestured with his rifle to the scene of desperation and bloodshed around them. The dead man, the wounded horse, the tracks of the fleeing posse. "This is not discreet." His gaze then moved to the crying infant in Ilara's arms. He looked at the child for a long, silent moment. "That child's father is a cruel man," he said, his voice still level. "Crueler than him," he added, nodding at Silas's body. "To take her back to him would be no kindness." In that moment, something shifted in the cold, professional calculus of the manhunter. Perhaps it was the weariness of the long chase. Perhaps it was the sight of their raw, brutal desperation, or perhaps, buried deep beneath the surface, he had a hidden code of his own. He made a decision. "As far as my report will state," he said, his gaze meeting Jack's, "the mother and child perished in the wilderness. Their trail was lost in the storm." He turned, without another word, without a backward glance, and walked away. He climbed the ridge and disappeared over the other side, a ghost of a threat that had chosen to evaporate into the cold winter air. The resolution was quiet and somber. Jack and Ilara were left alone in the silent, snow-covered landscape, with the body of their tormentor lying a few feet away. They were battered, emotionally shattered. But they were alive. They were free. Without speaking, they went to Silas's horse, which stood untethered nearby. They took the saddlebags, which held a small amount of food and a flask of whiskey, and the rifle from the scabbard. Then, without looking back, they walked away, heading east into the vast, unknown territory. The final scene took place several weeks later. They had traveled far, crossing the border into a new territory where the names Croft and Thorne meant nothing. They were anonymous, just another family seeking a new start in the West. They had found a place, a secluded, fertile valley nestled between two high mesas, a place with good water and rich soil, a place that felt like a promise. The story ends not with a grand declaration of love or a triumphant celebration, but with a simple, hopeful image. Jack is building a small, sturdy cabin, the rhythmic sound of his axe echoing in the quiet valley. The walls are half up, the fresh-cut pine logs smelling clean and sharp in the cool evening air. A short distance away, Ilara is sitting on a log, humming a soft, nameless tune to Lily, who is nestled in her lap, healthy and content. The sun is setting, bathing the valley in a warm, golden light that makes the new green shoots of spring grass seem to glow. Jack pauses in his work, leaning on the handle of his axe, and watches them. He watches the way the golden light catches in Ilara's hair, the way her hand rests protectively on the baby's back. He catches her eye, and she gives him a small, genuine smile, not the sad, haunted smile he was used to, but a real one that reached her eyes. It was the first one he had ever truly seen, and he smiles back. The ghosts of their pasts are not gone. The scars, both seen and unseen, remain deep and permanent. But here, in this quiet valley, they no longer dominate the landscape of their lives. In the peaceful quiet of the evening, surrounded by the promise of the home they are building together, there is not the end of sorrow, but the peaceful, resilient beginning of a life. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire, and we encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.